Sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the deepest truth. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses as deals worth over $5 million floated between polished words and measured smiles. But at the far end of the table, an elderly woman sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to speak, her Italian slipping through hesitant English that no one seemed to understand. Not the servers, not the executives, not even the man seated at the center of it all. Luca Moretti, a billionaire known for controlling every outcome, every number, every conversation. Yet in that moment, he didn't notice her struggle, his attention locked on contracts and signatures, his voice calm, precise, distant, until her voice cracked just enough to disappear into the noise. And something shifted, something subtle, almost invisible, as a waitress who had been standing quietly near the edge of the room finally moved, her steps soft, measured, unnoticed by everyone except the woman who looked up with fading hope. And then it happened. A single sentence, spoken gently in perfect Italian. Signora, mi dica, sono, aiutarla. And the world seemed to pause, not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet cinematic way where even the air feels different. Luca's pen stopped mid-signature, his hand hovering as his mind tried to catch up with what his ears had just heard, because that voice, that accent, it wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't learned from a textbook. It was lived, and slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned his eyes, landing on the waitress for the first time, really seeing her, not as part of the background, not as another uniform in motion, but as someone who had just crossed an invisible line he didn't even know existed. And she didn't look nervous. She didn't rush. She simply knelt slightly beside his mother, her posture respectful, her tone warm, speaking not just words, but comfort, translating not just language, but emotion. And the old woman's face softened, her shoulders easing as she responded. Her voice now steady, alive again, as if someone had finally opened a door she had been knocking on all evening, and Luca watched, silent, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest, because for the first time that night, the most important conversation in the room had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with being understood. And when his mother reached out, gently taking the waitress's hand, whispering something that made her eyes glisten just slightly under the warm light, Luca stood, drawn closer without realizing it, his world narrowing to that moment. That connection, that quiet power he couldn't explain. And when the waitress finally looked up, meeting his gaze, there was no apology in her eyes, no fear, just a calm presence that unsettled him more than any challenge ever had. And he heard himself ask, softer than he intended, "Where did you learn to speak like that?" But even as the question left his lips, he already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Because some voices aren't taught, they're earned. And something about her told him this was only the beginning of a story he wasn't prepared for. Emily did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than any explanation could, her fingers gently slipping from his mother's grasp as she stood up, smooth, composed, as if she had not just shifted the entire atmosphere of a room filled with power and money. And for a brief second, Luca felt something unfamiliar. Not control, not certainty, but curiosity, sharp and persistent, pressing against the edges of his thoughts as he studied her, really studied her, the way she held herself, the way she did not rush to impress him, did not lower her gaze like others did not react to his presence the way people usually did, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because he was used to being the center of gravity in every room, used to people adjusting themselves around him. But Emily Carter did not adjust. She simply existed, calm, steady, like she belonged exactly where she was. And somehow that made him feel like he was the one out of place. His mother said something, softly in Italian again, her voice warmer now, lighter, and Emily responded with a small smile, her tone gentle, respectful, but distant in a way that suggested boundaries Luca could not see but could clearly feel. And that only deepened the mystery, because people usually leaned in when given his attention. They did not step back, and yet Emily took a subtle step away, not physically, but in presence, as if she had already done what she came to do, and nothing more was required. She says, "You remind her of home." Emily translated simply, her voice even, her expression unreadable, and Luca glanced at his mother, who nodded with a soft, emotional smile that he had not seen in a long time. Not since before the long flights, the boardrooms, the years that had slowly replaced warmth with efficiency. And for a moment, something tightened in his chest again, something he could not immediately define. "You did not just translate," he said, his voice lower now, less commanding, more searching. "You understood her," and Emily met his gaze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to realize there was a story behind her eyes, something layered, something carefully held back. "Understanding is not about language," she replied quietly. "It is about listening." And then she turned slightly, already preparing to leave, to return to the role everyone else expected her to stay in. But Luca was not ready to let the moment go. Not yet, because something about it felt unfinished, like a conversation that had only just begun. "Wait," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop it. And that alone surprised him, because he did not wait for people. People waited for him. Emily paused, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, and in that small, controlled movement, there was a quiet strength that made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about presence. "You learned that in Italy," he said, more statement than question, trying to piece together the fragments, the accent, the familiarity, the ease. But Emily shook her head slightly, a soft, almost imperceptible motion. "No," she said, and this time there was something different in her voice, something deeper, something that carried weight beyond the moment. "I learned it from someone who did not have time left to speak anymore," and the words landed between them, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to shift something inside him. Because suddenly, this was no longer about language, no longer about surprise. It was about loss, about presence, about the kind of understanding that could not be bought. And for the first time that evening, Luca Moretti had nothing to say, his world of precise answers and controlled outcomes replaced by a single, quiet realization that the woman standing in front of him was not part of his world at all. And yet somehow, she had. Just changed it. The room did not return to normal. Not right away. Because something invisible had shifted and no one could quite name it. Conversations resumed, but softer now, as if people sensed they had witnessed something they were not meant to interrupt, and Luca remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his attention still fixed on Emily as she moved away with quiet precision, picking up a tray, adjusting a glass, slipping back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if nothing had happened at all. And that unsettled him even more. Because moments like that were supposed to change people, to leave a mark, to create a reaction, but she carried on as if it had simply been part of her job. And maybe to her, it was. His mother touched his arm lightly, drawing his attention back, her expression thoughtful, her eyes still following Emily with a softness that made him pause. "She is a kind soul," she said in Italian, her voice steady now, grounded, and Luca nodded slowly. Though the words did not feel sufficient to describe what he had just witnessed, because kindness alone did not explain the depth, the timing, the quiet confidence. There was something else, something practiced, something earned. "Do you know her?" he asked almost without thinking, and his mother shook her head gently. "No, but she speaks like someone who has listened for a long time." And that sentence stayed with him, echoing in a way that disrupted his usual clarity, because listening was not a skill he had ever valued highly, not in the world he operated in, where speed, precision, and control mattered more than silence. And yet, somehow, this waitress had just demonstrated a form of power he could not quantify. Across the room, Emily placed an order ticket down, her handwriting neat, controlled, the kind of detail that did not go unnoticed by someone like him. And he found himself watching her again, not out of habit, but intention now, tracing the small things, the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken, the way she navigated conversations without inserting herself into them, the way she remained present without demanding attention. And the more he observed, the clearer it became that this was not accidental. This was someone who understood people, not superficially but deeply, instinctively, and that realization stirred something both intriguing and unsettling within him. Because he had built his life on understanding systems, markets, strategies, But people, real people, were far less predictable and far more dangerous to underestimate. One of his colleagues leaned in, asking a question about the contract, but Luca did not respond immediately, his mind still elsewhere, still replaying her words, her tone, the quiet weight behind them, from someone who did not have time left to speak anymore. It was not just an answer, it was a glimpse, and he knew better than to ignore glimpses like that. They often led to truths others overlooked. He finally sat down, the chair feeling unfamiliar for a brief second, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just slightly, and he picked up his pen again, but the numbers in front of him felt less urgent now, less absolute, because for the first time in a long time, something outside his carefully constructed world had interrupted the pattern, and as he signed the final page, his signature precise as always, he made a quiet decision, not spoken, not announced, but certain he would not let this moment disappear into routine, because people like Emily Carter did not simply appear without reason, and whatever story she carried, whatever truth was hidden behind that calm voice and steady gaze, he intended to understand it, not as a billionaire, not as a man used to control, but as someone who had just realized there was a language he had never truly learned, and for the first time, he wanted to. The dinner continued, but Luca no longer experienced it the same way, the voices around him blending into a distant hum as his attention kept drifting back to a single point across the room. Emily Carter, moving through her shift with the same quiet precision, the same calm presence that now felt impossible to ignore, and the more he watched, the more inconsistencies he noticed, small details that did not align with the role she appeared to play, the way she carried a tray with effortless balance, yet never rushed, the way she anticipated a guest's request before it was spoken, the way she adjusted her tone, depending on who she addressed, subtle, controlled, intentional. This was not random, this was training, or something close to it, and Luca had spent his entire career recognizing patterns, recognizing value where others saw none, and what he was seeing now did not fit into any category he knew. One of the executives across from him laughed loudly, attempting to pull him back into the conversation about projected returns and expansion timelines, but Luca only nodded slightly, offering just enough response to maintain the illusion of presence while his mind remained elsewhere. Because for the first time in years, something felt more compelling than numbers, more complex than strategy, and far less predictable. His mother spoke again, softly, asking a simple question about the menu, but this time, before Luca could respond, Emily was already there, not interrupting, not imposing, just arriving at the exact moment she was needed, as if she had been listening the entire time. "Would you like me to recommend something traditional?" she asked in Italian, her voice warm, respectful, and his mother's face lit up again, that same genuine smile that had become increasingly rare over the years. And Luca watched closely, this time not just observing, but analyzing, trying to understand the mechanics behind what felt almost effortless, because people did not simply appear at the right moment without intention. They did not create comfort without effort, and yet Emily made it look natural, seamless, and that unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss. "You have been here before," he said suddenly, his voice cutting gently into the moment, not accusatory, but certain. Emily paused just slightly, a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Luca, it was enough. It was confirmation that there was something more beneath the surface. She turned her gaze toward him, calm as ever. "No," she replied, her tone even. "I just pay attention." And again, the simplicity of her answer only deepened the complexity of what he was trying to understand. Because attention, real attention, was something rare, something undervalued, something he himself had not practiced in a long time, and yet here she was demonstrating it with quiet mastery. His mother placed her hand over Emily's briefly, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation, and Emily responded with a small nod, respectful, contained, as if she understood the weight of that gesture without needing to hold on to it. And then she stepped away once more, returning to her work, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Luca leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze following her for a moment longer before shifting back to the table. But nothing in front of him held the same clarity it had just an hour ago, because now there was a question, one that refused to settle, not about business, not about outcomes, but about something far less tangible. Who was she really, and why did it feel like she had just revealed something about his world that he had been too busy to see? And for the first time, Luca Moretti realized that control was not always about having answers. Sometimes it was about knowing when you had finally found the right question by the time dessert menus were placed on the table. Luca had stopped pretending to focus on the meeting entirely. The numbers blurred together, the voices lost their sharp edges, and instead, his attention followed a different rhythm, one defined by the quiet movement of a single person across the room. Emily Carter, who continued her work with the same steady composure, as if she had not shifted something fundamental in him just minutes earlier. And that contrast only deepened his curiosity, because he had built his entire life on cause and effect, on visible reactions, on measurable outcomes. Yet here was someone who created impact without seeking acknowledgement, without altering her pace, without even looking back, and that made her presence more powerful. Not less. His colleagues began discussing final signatures and timelines, their voices carrying the familiar confidence of men who believed they controlled the outcome of everything in front of them. But Luca no longer shared that certainty, because control required understanding. And right now, there was something he did not understand at all. He leaned slightly toward his assistant, his voice low, measured. "Who is she?" he asked, not taking his eyes off Emily as she set down a plate at another table. His assistant hesitated, clearly unsure, flipping through mental notes that did not exist. "Just one of the servers, sir," he replied quietly. And Luca almost smiled at the simplicity of that answer, because it felt incomplete, insufficient, like describing a symphony as background noise. And that only confirmed what he already suspected. She was being overlooked by everyone else, which meant he was the only one asking the right question. Across the room, Emily paused briefly near the service station, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter as she reviewed an order, and for a moment, the movement stopped, not dramatically, just a subtle stillness. But Luca noticed it, the way her shoulders lowered slightly, the way her expression softened just enough to suggest something internal, something unspoken, and then it was gone, replaced by the same composed presence as she picked up another tray and moved forward again. But that single moment lingered in his mind because it revealed something real, something human beneath the control, and it reminded him of her words about someone who did not have time left to speak anymore. That was not a rehearsed line. It was not meant to impress. It was something she carried, something that shaped the way she listened, the way she responded, the way she existed in a world that moved too fast for most people to notice. His mother finished her dessert slowly, savoring each bite, her mood noticeably lighter, and she looked at him with a quiet, knowing expression that made him pause. "You should thank her properly," she said in Italian, her tone gentle but certain. And Luca nodded, though the word properly echoed differently in his mind, because this was not about tipping generously or offering polite gratitude. This required something else, something more intentional, more personal, something he was not entirely used to offering: respect without expectation, recognition without transaction. He stood as the meeting concluded, the sound of chairs shifting and conversations closing filling the space. But his focus remained fixed, and as Emily approached their table one final time, her posture calm, her expression neutral, ready to complete her role and move on, Lucas stepped forward slightly, closing the distance in a way that was not commanding but deliberate. And for the first time that evening, he was not acting as a billionaire addressing staff. He was simply a man standing in front of someone he did not yet understand. And that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. Because this time, when he spoke, there was no authority in his tone, only quiet intent. "Emily," he said, using her name carefully, as if acknowledging it carried weight, "I would like to understand something." And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Luca Moretti was not asking a question to test someone, to challenge them, or to control the outcome. He was asking because he genuinely did not have the answer. And that alone marked the beginning of something he could not yet define. Emily did not react immediately to his words, and that pause felt intentional, not hesitant, as if she was measuring the weight of his question rather than the authority behind it, her eyes meeting his with the same calm steadiness that had unsettled him from the beginning. And for a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again, not because it actually disappeared, but because his attention narrowed completely, focused on the space between them. "What would you like to understand?" she asked quietly, her tone neither defensive nor impressed. Simply present. And that alone shifted the dynamic in a way Luca could not ignore, because people usually anticipated what he wanted before he said it. They filled the silence quickly, eager to align with his expectations. But Emily did not fill anything. She allowed the question to exist, to breathe, and that forced him to be more precise than he was used to. He exhaled slowly, something rare, something uncalculated. "You listened to my mother like you knew her," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual edge. "That is not something people learn from a book." And Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before her eyes softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition of the truth behind his words. "No," she said, her voice steady. "It is not." And there it was again, that quiet confirmation that what she carried went beyond skill, beyond language, into something far more personal. Luca waited, expecting more, but she did not offer it. Not yet. And that restraint only deepened his curiosity, because in his world, information was currency. It flowed quickly, exchanged, leveraged, but here it was being held carefully, intentionally, and for the first time, he understood that not everything could be accessed on demand. His mother watched the exchange with a gentle expression, her hands folded calmly in her lap, as if she already understood something he was still trying to grasp. When someone is about to lose their voice, Emily continued after a moment, her words measured, each one placed with care, they stop speaking to be heard, and they start speaking to be understood. The sentence settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and Luca felt it land somewhere deeper than he expected, because it was not just an explanation, it was a perspective he had never considered. His entire life had been built on being heard, on making statements that carried weight, that influenced outcomes, but understood, truly understood, that was something else. Entirely, something he had not prioritized, something he had not even realized he was missing. "And you learned that," he said slowly, almost to himself, trying to piece together the fragments. But Emily shook her head gently, a small movement that carried more certainty than any long explanation could. "I experienced it," she replied, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in her voice, not weakness, not hesitation, but depth, something that suggested memory, something that suggested loss without needing to describe it. Luca nodded slightly, though the gesture felt incomplete because there were still pieces missing, still questions unanswered, but something told him that pressing further in that moment would break the balance that had formed. And for once, he chose not to push, not to demand clarity. Instead, he stepped back just enough to acknowledge the boundary she had set without words. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised even him, because it was not a transaction, not a polite formality, it was genuine, unguarded, and Emily recognized that, her expression softening just slightly before returning to its usual composure. She gave a small nod, professional yet sincere, and then she turned, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with quiet finality, returning to her work as if the moment had reached its natural end. And Lucas stood there for a second longer, watching her disappear back into the rhythm of the room, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he had not gained control of the situation, he had gained perspective. And somehow, that felt far more valuable. The evening should have ended there, neatly, predictably, like every other high-level dinner Luca had ever attended. Contract signed, hands shaken, outcome secured. But as he walked toward the exit beside his mother, something resisted closure, something quiet but persistent, pulling his attention back toward the dining room he had already mentally left. His mother slowed her steps slightly, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You are thinking about her," she said in Italian, not as a question, but as an observation, and Luca exhaled softly, a faint smile. Touching his lips, "I am thinking about what she understands that I do not," he replied, and that answer lingered between them, heavier than it sounded, because for a man who built an empire on knowing, on predicting, on controlling, admitting a gap in understanding was not small. It was fundamental. They reached the entrance, the city lights reflecting through the glass, casting long, soft shadows across polished floors. But before stepping out, Luca paused, his gaze shifting back one last time. And there she was again, not at their table, not in the center of attention, just moving quietly between others. Present but never intrusive, and it struck him then, fully, clearly, that her strength did not come from being seen. It came from choosing when to be seen, and that was a kind of control he had never practiced. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp against his skin, the distant hum of traffic replacing the muted conversations of the restaurant. His driver stepped forward, opening the door, but Luca did not move immediately, his attention still anchored somewhere behind him. "You should go back," his mother said softly, and he looked at her, slightly surprised. "Go back," she repeated, a knowing warmth in her eyes. Not as a businessman, not as someone who wants answers, but as someone who is ready to listen. And for a moment, Luca stood still, the weight of that distinction settling in, because listening, real listening, required something he was not used to offering. It required patience. It required humility. It required letting go of the need to direct the outcome. And yet, something inside him recognized that this was exactly what had drawn him in from the beginning. Without another word, he turned, leaving the open car door behind, his steps measured but certain as he walked back toward the entrance. The doorman glanced at him briefly, surprised, but said nothing as Luca passed by, re-entering the space he had just exited. And this time, everything felt different, not because the room had changed, but because he had the noise, the movement, the polished elegance of it all no longer held the same authority over his attention. Instead, he moved with a quieter focus, scanning the room, not for opportunity, not for advantage, but for presence. And when he found her, standing near the service station, reviewing an order with that same calm concentration, he did not interrupt, he did not call her name, he simply waited, and that alone marked a shift, because Luca Moretti had never been a man who waited, not for people, not for moments, not for anything, but now he stood there, patient, silent, allowing the space to exist without filling it. And after a few seconds, Emily looked up, sensing rather than hearing him, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of recognition. Not surprise, not curiosity, just awareness. And in that quiet exchange, without a single word spoken yet, something had already changed, because this time, he was not there to understand her story. He was there to hear it. If she chose to tell it, Emily did not speak right away when their eyes met again. And this time, the silence felt different, not like a pause between tasks, but like a space being offered, one that did not need to be filled unless it mattered. And Luca remained where he was, not stepping closer, not asserting presence, simply standing within that quiet distance, allowing her to decide what came next. And that choice, subtle as it was, shifted everything between them, because for the first time, control did not belong to him. It belonged to the moment itself. She finished reviewing the order in her hand, setting it down carefully before turning fully toward him, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, but her attention now entirely present. "You came back," she said, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Luca nodded. Once a small, deliberate movement. "I did," he replied, his voice steady but softer than before, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke again, the sounds of the restaurant continuing around them, plates clinking, voices blending, but none of it intruded on the space they now shared, because it had narrowed into something focused, something intentional. "You said you experienced it," Luca continued, his words careful, measured, not pushing, not demanding. "What did you mean?" And Emily held his gaze, her eyes steady, but this time there was no distance in them, only depth, the kind that suggested she had already decided whether to answer before he even asked. She exhaled quietly, not as hesitation, but as preparation. "There was a man," she began, her voice calm, He came into a small hospital where I used to volunteer. He did not speak much English, and most people did not take the time to understand him. Her words moved slowly, deliberately, each one placed with care, and Luca listened, not analyzing, not interrupting, simply receiving, something he was still learning how to do. He was not afraid of being sick, she continued. He was afraid of not being understood. Before he left, and the sentence settled softly, carrying a weight that did not need emphasis, because it was already there, Luca felt it, not as a concept, but as something real, something human. So I stayed, Emily said, her voice unchanged, but her eyes shifting slightly, as if the memory lived somewhere just beyond the present moment. I listened. I learned his words, his tone, the way he spoke when he was not trying to explain, but trying to be heard. She paused, just briefly, and Luca did not move, did not speak, did not break the rhythm she had created. And when he could not speak anymore, she added quietly, I spoke for him, not perfectly, but honestly. And there it was, the answer he had been searching for, not a skill, not a talent, but a choice repeated, intentional, shaped by something deeper than ambition or recognition. That is what your mother needed, Emily finished simply. Not translation, understanding. The words lingered, not dramatic, not heavy-handed, just true. And Lucas stood there, absorbing it, realizing that everything he had seen, everything that had unsettled him, came down to something he had overlooked his entire life. The difference between hearing and listening, between speaking and understanding, and for a moment, he did not respond, because there was nothing immediate to say, no solution to offer, no conclusion to draw. Only a quiet recognition that what she had given his mother was something no amount of influence could replace. And as he looked at her, really looked this time, he saw it clearly, not just who she was in that moment, but what she carried. And for the first time, Luca Moretti understood that some people do not change a room by being louder. They change it by knowing exactly when to speak, and more importantly, when to listen. For a long moment, Luca did not speak, and that silence was not empty. It was full of everything he had just heard, everything he had just realized, and everything he had never taken the time to understand before. The noise of the restaurant slowly returning around them, but no longer felt the same, because now it carried a contrast he could not ignore. Voices speaking, but not always connecting, words exchanged, but not always understood. And standing in front of Emily, he finally recognized the difference, not as an idea, but as something real, something he had just witnessed. You stayed, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, the weight of that simple truth settling in, because staying required something he had rarely given, time without agenda, presence without purpose. And Emily did not correct him. She did not expand on it. She simply acknowledged it with the slightest nod, as if the meaning did not need to be explained further, because some things were not meant to be detailed, only understood. Luca glanced briefly toward the table where his mother had been sitting earlier, now empty, but the memory of her expression remained clear, that softness, that calm, that sense of being seen, and he realized then that what Emily had given her was not a service. It was a moment of dignity, something no transaction could replicate, something no position could guarantee. And for the first time in a long time, Luca felt something shift within himself, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, like a quiet adjustment in the way he saw the world. I spend my life making sure people hear me, he said after a moment, his voice calm, unguarded. But I'm not sure I have been listening, and the honesty in that statement was not strategic. It was real, and Emily recognized that, her expression softening just enough to reflect. Most people do not realize the difference until it matters, she replied gently, her tone not critical, not superior, just honest. And Luca let out a small breath, something between acceptance and understanding, because for once he was not trying to solve anything. He was simply allowing the truth to exist. My mother felt at home tonight, he added, and there was something deeper in his voice now, something quieter, something that carried more weight than any business decision he had made that day. That has not happened in a long time. Emily's gaze held his for a second longer, and in that brief moment, there was no distance, no role, no hierarchy, just two people sharing it. understanding that did not need to be explained further. Sometimes home is not a place, she said softly. It is a feeling of being understood, and those words settled into him. Not as information, but as something lasting, something that would stay long after the evening ended. Lucan nodded slowly, not because he needed to respond, but because he understood, and that understanding felt different from anything he had experienced before, quieter, but deeper. "Thank you, Emily," he said. And this time, the words carried no expectation, no transaction, only recognition, and she accepted them the same way she had done everything else that night, with calm, with grace, with no need to hold on to them. "You are welcome," she replied, her voice steady. And then she stepped back, not to leave, but to return, to continue, to move forward in the same quiet way she always had. And Luca watched her for a moment longer before turning toward the exit once more. But this time, he did not feel the same need to look back, because he knew that what mattered was not behind him. It was within him now, a shift in perspective, a new awareness, a different way of seeing. And as he stepped out into the night, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, he realized that not all lessons come from power. Some come from presence, and the ones that stay are often spoken in the quietest voice.